Big breaking news out of Capitol Hill. Top Democrat Hakeem Jeffries says Democrats should vote to oust Republican Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Jake Sherman reports. Here's Representative Jake Sherman reports, here's his tweet. Representative Jeffries definitively called for a vote against any procedural motion to delay the motion to vacate. And he said Democrats should vote to oust McCarthy. So as we talked about in an earlier segment, without the help of some Democrats either abstaining and lowering the total number that McCarthy needs to get majority support, or crossing the line to vote for Kevin McCarthy as Speaker, he's out. He said as much in a clip that we played earlier today. Here's a little bit more. Representative Jayapal spoke on the matter at length. We're going to get to that in a second. But first, Manu Raju tweeted, "Every Democrat I've spoken with has come out of the meeting ready to sink McCarthy. The leadership wants to have consensus position. Jeffries will soon put out a statement. McCarthy's speakership very much in doubt at the moment." Now, here's Representative Jayapal giving her view on the matter.
They are destroying our institution.
But what does that mean? Does that mean voting present? Like, how is this going to play out?
We are not voting in any way that would help save Speaker McCarthy.
So either present or voting against him.
This does impact Democrats in a sense, right? I mean, you guys are trying to fund the government. You're trying to pass the Farm Bill. You're trying to pass
a Democratic problem. As much as anybody out here might want to make it a Democratic problem, this is not a Democratic problem. This is a Republican problem. They supposedly have the majority. They should be able to pick their own speaker. Our speaker is Hakeem Jeffries. It always has been. It was for 15 rounds. It will continue to be.
So does that mean
here that just nobody trusts Kevin McCarthy?
Nobody trusts Kevin McCarthy. Nobody trusts Kevin McCarthy. And why should we? He has broken his commitment over and over again. And it's not just the deal with President Biden. It's not just the Ukraine funding, which apparently was also a deal, but then it wasn't a deal on, unless we secure the border. It's also going back to January 6th. And I think for a lot of us, we were here. It is still deeply emotional for us because it is about our country. It's about why we came to Congress. And Kevin McCarthy stood on the House floor and said one thing and then talked to Donald Trump and immediately did something else. He has.
All right. That's pretty big news. As we ran through today, and as you heard Jayapal allude to, there are ways that they can vote that would help McCarthy, even if it weren't an explicit vote for McCarthy. And she seems to be saying they're not going to do any of that. They're not going to abstain. They're not going to vote present. They're not going to just not show up. They're not going to do anything that helps them. It looks like they're going to do what they did in January when there were those 15 consecutive rounds of voting to get Kevin McCarthy in this position to begin with, which is to all vote in lockstep, presumably for Hakeem Jeffries, and Republicans have to figure this out on their own. What do you make of this play?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that they're not voting present. They won't vote to table. I believe that this is potentially something that came out of the Biden administration, right? Jayapal says this is not just about the promise to Biden, which tells us what Karine Jean-Pierre wouldn't, which is that there was a deal that Biden had with Kevin McCarthy, and it seems that McCarthy broke that deal. So he's lost the support of even the most establishment Democrats, it seems, because it would be convenient if they didn't want to go through the process of having a new speaker. If they wanted to continue on with the status quo, they could have very easily had 4 of their members vote one way, vote to table, vote present. But it's interesting that the entire caucus, as Jayapal indicates, and as these congressional reporters are indicating, are in lockstep and are okay with McCarthy being ousted. So it's an interesting turn of events, but it seems to be hinging on this broken promise to Biden, in my opinion.
I think you're right about that. Apart from making the Republicans look sort of disorganized to the 5% of Americans who are watching the news and follow things like this, what advantage is there for the Democratic Party? I mean, I appreciate Jayapal wanting to be really clear that this is a Republican issue that was brought upon themselves and not having anything to do with Democrats, but it is an American issue insofar as the work of Congress can't go forward, the work of the House can't go forward until a speaker is chosen. And there are priorities that Americans have beyond deciding what John Fetterman is or isn't allowed to wear into chambers. So, what is there to be gained by this, especially given that, as I understand it, Speaker McCarthy has picked who is interim speaker while the vote is being conducted?
Yeah, I think strategically on the Democrat side, we see Democrats so often work with Republicans, and we know that the Republicans aren't going to make good on their word. They say things like, we want to push the issue of abortion back onto the states, and then a few months later, we have people like Lindsey Graham saying that, yeah, it is their intent, actually, to move forward with a nationwide abortion ban at 6 weeks or so. So they go back on their word a lot. You have a lot of Republicans that are willing to work with Democrats in a bipartisan manner, but so often those promises are broken. This seems to me them actually showing, what, if you break a promise to us, we're actually not going to support you. So the next speaker needs to be willing to work with us in a bipartisan manner and actually make good on their promises. Usually I think the Democrats are pretty weak when it comes to situations like this, where they work with Republicans, they make promises and they break them. Usually we don't see a lot of repercussions, and this seems to be a change in that. I don't know if the message they're trying to send is that the next Speaker of the House, if you're willing to work with us in a bipartisan manner, that's fine. We'll cooperate with you so long as you really do keep those promises. Strategically, is that useful? I don't know who they're going to select instead of Speaker McCarthy. It sounds like they're all planning on voting for Jeffries. So it could be another long voting session for the next Speaker of the House.
Yeah, there are kind of unofficially, I think, as many as 40 people who identify as being in the Freedom Caucus. But during that speakership vote showdown in January, it was just a handful of holdouts that were really directing this whole thing. And remember, at the end of the day, while there were this critical handful that were willing to vote for various other members of the Freedom Caucus, as a placeholder to demonstrate that they weren't going to vote for Kevin McCarthy, there wasn't a plurality. So I'm trying to just think through the likelihood that you're going to get an actual Freedom Caucus person in this seat. Seems highly unlikely. And so then it comes down to whether or not there's another consensus, sort of moderate, but malleable establishment Republican that is better for the Freedom Caucus than what Kevin McCarthy is. So it does really feel like a sort of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic sort of a situation from the perspective of the Freedom Caucus, but they may again be able to extract some concessions in exchange for ultimately voting for Kevin McCarthy after some more rounds. So we cannot shake a stick at the fact that they would not have the power for any one member to instigate this motion to vacate, but for the fact that they did this maneuver back in January. They would not have these seats on various committees that they were able to secure, but for their willingness to do this back in January. And it shouldn't also be ignored that not only did the Democrats, the progressive, have an opportunity to do this back in 2001, there is some horse trading that could conceivably be done if the progressives were willing to, yes, vote for Kevin McCarthy in exchange for their own benefits within the House right now. And that seems to be completely and totally off the table, even though we have seen demonstrably some real targeting of the progressives by the House Democrats over their views, namely a support of Palestine. You've seen Hakeem Jeffries' own super PAC and his very close alignment with AIPAC in Israel, who he says is the 6th borough of New York, specifically targeting progressives, even though they are oftentimes incumbents, because of their views on that issues. No matter what it seems Hakeem Jeffries has done to those progressives, they're making it really clear right now they will always stand, for better or for worse, with the Democratic Party.
Yeah, it's also interesting that the name thrown out was Tom Emmer, the majority whip for the House Republicans. The same guy that was whipping the votes for Kevin McCarthy, the same guy that was responsible for whipping the votes for the stopgap bill. I just don't know that he's going to have the faith of the House Republicans to be the next speaker. I also don't know that he would do a better job than Kevin McCarthy. I think the House is too divided for there to be a candidate that's really going to satisfy the Freedom Caucus and the rest of the House Republicans. And so that puts us in a situation where you're right. I think Kevin McCarthy could be the Speaker of the House again. Ultimately, there could be some horse trading done on the floor. I think probably your theory is more likely that, the Matt Gaetz and the Freedom Caucus have lost trust in McCarthy, are not willing to make any more deals with him, are probably not willing to give him a second chance. But maybe they would be if they consider the alternative, which I think is more likely, where some Democrats decide to get some concessions from McCarthy, and he decides to try and repair the relationship he's apparently broken by breaking his promise to President Biden. And so it's an interesting situation, but I think Kevin McCarthy is not coming out strong, even if he is Speaker of the House again. I think he wanted to be the leader, but didn't want to be accountable to the caucus that elected him, and I think he learned a valuable lesson here.
And the longer this goes on, the more pressure there's going to be for various Republican presidential candidates to also weigh in. I'm very curious to see how that plays out and if there are any implications more broadly for the Republican Party and the credibility in the eyes of the public that already has such a low view of Congress and their commitment to actually working for the people as opposed to for themselves. All right, we'll continue to follow this story. Please do stick around. We'll have more Rising for you right after this.